Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Christian Head. I'm a solutions advisor here at SureCloud, and I'll be going through the webinar today. So let me go ahead and get my screen shared here. We'll start walking through a few slides. So today we're going to be going through how to bring complex vulnerability data to life. More specifically, we're going to be looking at how to really contextualize that vulnerability data. So how can we go ahead and look at that really granular vulnerability data and see exactly how that relates or affects the overarching business objectives? And I think it all first starts by asking yourself whether or not you think you have an organizational divide, and just to set the scene by what I mean by that. So if I go ahead and click through here, so you can see we have the wall here representing that divide. On the left-hand side, we have a robust risk program and our compliance activities. And within that, we're going to have, as I mentioned, a very robust risk program where we're able to identify a risk. We're working that through the workflow all the way through mitigation and treatment. And we're very aware of how these risks are going to impact the overall business objectives and the impact that we are exposed to. And on the other side, we have our compliance activities, right? So maybe we're aligned to a few different frameworks. We've been deploying those controls, and those controls are being tested. And not only are they effective, but they're also mature, and we have evidence to support that. So across our reports and dashboards, everything is green. The organization thinks everything is good to go. But on the other end, we have our technical assurance, our security teams, our IT teams that are helping to support those digital assets. So they have they've been swamped with hundreds, if not thousands, of different incidents, issues that they're trying to remediate. They're having a hard time to understand exactly how do we prioritize these in order to really help to achieve those business objectives. So how can one side be showing that everything is good to go and green across the board, but on the other, we have red alarms and red lights flashing when they're so closely related? So why does this happen? And I think that happens for one of a few different reasons. So we'll be going through three today. The first being lack of context. So exactly what I was saying previously. So really understanding and contextualizing how these different IT resources underpin or support any critical business process or service. Next is going to be being lost in translation. So as I'm sure you're aware, the business language utilized on the business side of the organization is very different from the IT side. So as we begin to look at those different acronyms and understanding and communicating, it can be very confusing, and you can be lost in translation, which then leads into our third, which is that knowledge gap. So with the lack of context and struggling to communicate, there's going to be poor communication between those business owners that support the processes, as well as those more technical staff on the IT and security teams. So looking at this diagram, we can kind of see exactly that relationship we've already been discussing, right? So at the top level, we have our business outcome. Our business outcome could be anything from increasing revenue, reducing churn, whatever the scenario may be, whatever the organization's overarching objectives are. In order to achieve those are all going to be supported by different processes. So you could have many different processes to support that. A good example of that could be the revenue operations process. So looking at your sales, marketing, customer success teams. Maybe it's the starters or leavers process, or even looking at increasing demand gen, right? So these processes will support those business outcomes. And then below that, we're going to have our assets and then threats and vulnerabilities, which I'm sure you guys are more familiar with. Now, I do want to call out that we are aware that our assets are most likely not going to be as nice and tidy as we've previously seen in that diagram. It's probably going to be a messy relationship of different assets within your CMDB. But for demonstration purposes, we're going to go ahead and just keep it nice and tidy. Now, the middle area here, I want to go ahead and highlight, because this is the ideal state that we want to get to. We want to be able to look at these different processes that are supporting those objectives within the organization, but then also understand what digital assets the IT security teams are supporting that underpin these processes. In today's day, every process is supported by many different digital assets. So it's going to be important to get to that ideal state so that we can very clearly say that these threats and these vulnerabilities directly impact the processes that are going to help us to achieve business outcomes. So what does that new world feel like? What does the ideal state look like whenever we get there? The first and foremost, the business is going to be more informed, better protected. We're going to be able to very easily justify investment and spend for the security teams as well, since we now have the context to go ahead and then relate from that most granular level, being the vulnerabilities that we're ingesting, and seeing how that is going to play into affecting the digital assets and the processes that drive those business objectives forward. We're also going to be able to look at the remediation efforts and very easily prioritize those. So we understand exactly which objectives we're trying to achieve. We understand which of those processes are critical to achieving those. And since we have that end-to-end relationship, we can very easily prioritize remediation efforts as well as technical testing efforts as well. So what are the takeaways? What are our next practical steps? And the first one is going to be agreeing on that service or process-centric view of the world, performing that mapping exercise between our different processes and the digital assets that are going to support those. The next is going to be investing in a platform or a tool that's able to ingest all that information, all the way from your vulnerabilities to your assets to your processes, and then understanding exactly how they all relate and they're associated. And same can even be said with tying those into our risk within our risk register and the controls that maybe are related to the different assets that we're tracking. Once we have 1 and 2, we'll then be able to look at number 3. So lastly, it's going to be that continuous testing. So once we have that platform and we have that centralized view, we'll be able to prioritize based off those different business values and objectives. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop sharing quickly, and we'll go ahead and take a look at the SureCloud platform and be able to look at a real world example of this. So welcome to the SureCloud platform. If this is the first time you're seeing this, we are an integrated risk management solution. So we have a wide variety of different solutions across the GRC landscape. More specifically today, we're going to be going through a few different areas around the processes, assets, all the way down to the vulnerability management solution and risk management solution. So as we're walking through that, we'll go ahead and highlight those key areas. More specifically, what we're looking at now is the process dashboard or register. We do have dashboarding and reporting capabilities. So if we can go ahead and tailor those with a very simple view here, so we can see the process register. We can also see all of my processes that I've been assigned to. And if we had any inactive process, we'd also be able to track those processes below. The scenario we're going to be following today is going to be the revenue operations process. So I can easily navigate to that by clicking on it. Once we've done that, we're able to see the high-level details. So we can see the name, status, we can assign ownership to this process, as well as begin to categorize it for reporting. Going down a little further, we're also able to track different data types that may be associated with this process, as well as perform a sensitivity and security assessment against it. As this is an integrated solution, it does tie over to other areas and elements of the platform. So we do have a data privacy offering. So a lot of this information may be tied over to that as well. And then lastly, we have our association section. So at the very bottom of the page, you can see we have a table looking at a few different areas of the platform. We're going to be looking at the digital assets here. So it looks like we have 2 different assets that are supporting this process, but it could also be related to many different other areas as well. So it could be a subject access request, it could be an exception, maybe it's other processes within a process hierarchy or risks, you name it. As long as we're able to track that in the tool, we can begin to make those associations. So jumping into the laptops asset group, you can see a very similar view. So we have those high-level details at the top of the page. We can go ahead and provide a name for it, track the status, categorize it, see exactly where it's at in the life cycle or workflow. And depending on the asset, you may want to track some more granular details. So if I expand this full view section, we'll be able to go ahead and track quite a few different attributes. We can be very, very specific about the attributes we're tracking depending on the asset. I'll go ahead and collapse that. And below that, we're able to see the next layer, which is going to be our vulnerabilities within this asset. So this is an asset group, as you can see. So we've got it assigned to asset group A. Otherwise, if it's a specific device, we could go ahead and assign an IP or maybe even a URL or host name, and then pull over that vulnerability data that we're going to take a look at here in a second. So below that, we have the vulnerabilities associated to asset group A within our vulnerability management solution. You can see that we have 58 open vulnerabilities. So if I click on that, I'll be able to navigate over to those vulnerabilities. and we can take a look at some of the information surrounding those. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the vulnerability more specifically. And as you work your way to the right, we'll be able to see some of the high-level details as well. So the type, the asset group it's part of, the IP address, the service, all the way through the number of different actions or tasks related to it, and the severity and risk scoring. If I click into one of these vulnerabilities that we've ingested, we'll also be able to see a summary of that vulnerability, as well as a solution on how to fix that. As I mentioned, we can go ahead and raise tasks individually against these different vulnerabilities if we would like, very easily by going here and adding a task. Or if I wanted to go to a selection of vulnerabilities and assign tasks in bulk, as I would imagine, it's going to be pretty tedious to go ahead and click into each of those. You can also do it in bulk as well. Otherwise, the last thing I want to go ahead and point out on this end is the breadcrumbs at the top. So we can go ahead and see that we are following from the highest level being that process through to the digital asset supporting that. And we're now at those vulnerabilities within that asset. So using the same breadcrumbs, we'll go ahead and jump back to that asset and continue down the details for that asset. So you can see we have our data types, as well as that sensitivity and security assessment that we had previously seen on the process. We also perform the same sort of capability at the asset level as well. So we can see exactly what data types are associated with it, and as well as evaluate and assess it. And then we have our associations. So if we look at what the asset is related to, it could be any number of different assets as well. So we can begin to build out the associations from assets to assets. We're also able to tie in our controls. So within our compliance management solution, maybe we've deployed a handful of different controls and we want to begin to relate these controls to the assets, as well as see how effective these controls are. Next, we have our processes. So we've seen that we had our process related to this asset, but this asset could be related to many different processes. It is a many-to-many relationship. And then we have our risks. So if we wanted to go ahead and see exactly which risks are going to be affecting this asset, or even at the process level, which risks were affecting that process, we can very easily see that in a handful of details around that risk as well. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the data breach risk, as it was associated to that laptop's asset group. And we'll just walk through some of the details we're tracking at the risk within our risk management solution. So we'll have the name and status at the top. We'll also be able to walk through those high-level details for the risk as well within the summary section. Below that, we'll have our identify information, so we can begin to really define what this risk is. So what's the cause for the risk? Do we have any uncertainties around it? And if it were to occur, what would those effects be? And then we also have the capability to perform risk assessments within the tool. So in the summary section, we can see the most recent inherent risk and residual risk scores and how those have been trending over time. Below that, we have all the mitigating controls that we've linked to this risk. So you can see who's responsible for that control, how effective is the control. And then below that, we have our open actions. So as we go through that risk assessment process, we may want to go ahead and raise any number of actions to go ahead and treat that risk. Below that, as I mentioned, we do have the ability to go ahead and assess these risks. And we do provide a few different methodologies out of the box, depending on how the risk you're going to be assessing. Now below that, we have all the risks that have been performed historically. So we can go ahead and review that information. Otherwise, if you wanted to go ahead and perform a risk assessment, you could go ahead and choose that methodology and then kick off a new assessment as needed. And then as you imagine, across all the different areas, we're able to go ahead and do our associations. So if I want to see the assets related to this risk, maybe we have some exceptions in place for a specific duration that we've identified need to be put in place. Or maybe it's even a risk-to-risk relationship, and I want to see how these risks roll up to an overarching risk. We could also go ahead and make those relationships as well. Now, the last thing I want to go over is the ability to report on this data. So jumping over to our favorites page, we can then jump into a dashboard here and begin to look at exactly how this data can be reported on. In this scenario, I've made a CISO dashboard, so we can see a handful of different reports that may be relevant to the CISO role. So at the top of the page, we have our processes. So walking through the same sort of data that we've already looked at today, we'll be able to track all the process within our register. Potentially, maybe we want to go ahead and break that up by different purposes for processing. Maybe we want to look at the different processes by the business unit, or even begin to do some quantification and roll up the asset risk scores by each process so we know where to prioritize our attention. Below that, we have our assets. So we're going to have all of our different assets. We can also go ahead and categorize that by type. We can also look at maybe providing a count for the number of high-risk assets that we have. And then also, it could be useful to also see exactly how many assets are assigned to each owner. And then lastly, we have our vulnerability section. So referencing the vulnerability data that we've ingested into the tool, we can go ahead and look at the vulnerabilities by root cause, as well as the criticality with each of those. We can get more snapshot information around the vulnerabilities by the severity, by the business risk, or if we wanted to get more of a time series analysis, we can look at the business risk and the exposure to that over time. Now, this is a demo environment, so it doesn't look like we've been remediating any of these, so the exposure's been the same. But ideally, as you ingest new vulnerabilities and as you're going through and remediating these, this would be fluctuating over time and also showing the criticality of those. Lastly, we have our actions and tasks associated with that. We also can look at the different root causes for the vulnerabilities within the vulnerability management solution at the current state. And we can also go ahead and track by status as well. Now, scrolling back up to the top, across all of our different dashboarding and reporting, we're actually able to export this information. So if we wanted to use it elsewhere, certainly can. We just go to any of these reports, can copy the images, can download it into a few different file formats, or we can use our integration over into Power BI or Tableau and utilize those other reporting platforms as well. Lastly, we can also go ahead and schedule exports. So if I wanted to schedule this out at a monthly cadence, I can go ahead and choose that frequency, select the recipients I'd like to receive this dashboard, and then have that sit out at that cadence. Otherwise, that concludes the demonstration over bringing that complex vulnerability data to life, really contextualizing it and seeing how we can make those associations and, well, really just better make the connections to drive business objectives. So I will pause here and I will open it up to questions. If there's any questions at all, just go ahead and put those in the chat and we'll make a selection of you and get those answered. And if we don't get to the questions, we can always follow up with you as well. Okay, so it looks like there was a question on the expert reports and another question on any plans to have compliance map reporting like PCI, HIPAA, or FISMA. Yeah, so as far as our compliance solution is concerned, we can go ahead and deploy controls related to any of those different regulations and standards. So we can go ahead and deploy those and report on those different areas. And throughout those associations that we saw today, we can also begin to map those to the different processes, assets, risks, you name it. Then in regards to showing an exported PDF, what we can do, I'll just go to one of these and we can download that into a PDF and I can show you what that looks like. So you can see the report there. We probably want to adjust the size of it in the configuration settings, but depending on the size of it, we can go ahead and do that for any of these different portlets as well. Oh, yeah, it probably would help if I shared my screen. Apologies for that. Let me get my screen reshared. Okay, there we go. So I'll go ahead and I will export the report here. So we'll download those to not Excel, but we'll go to PDF. So we can go ahead and see the 4 different business units. So that's what an example of an exported report would look like. And you can adjust the size, I said, in the configuration settings. So depending on what you want to see, maybe you want to see a legend. You can also get that put in there as well. Maybe it's percentage values. We can also get that added to the different reports. Andy, yes, so the vulnerability data, this is an example, it's dummy data from a Tenable Nessus scan. So we've got ahead and imported that in. Otherwise, you can schedule imports. You can go ahead and manually import depending on the tool you're using. But but yes, this was data that was created for this demonstration. And yeah, you can consolidate these. So as I mentioned, we can schedule exports. So if we wanted to go ahead and schedule an export of a full dashboard, we could also do that. We could also go ahead and download the full PDF for a specific dashboard, and that'll give you the same sort of view, but for every single report. Yeah, sure thing. So if we're gonna take a look at the risk registers, there was some questions on the details within that. So I'll jump over to my favorites, and then we can go ahead and look at that. So this is the risk register, very similar to the other registers that we've taken a look at. So we can get a view of all the different risks in a central repository here. If we wanted to go ahead and raise any risks, it's easy as creating a new risk. Otherwise, we can review any of the data at this level as well within the risk details. So you can see a handful of different attributes here around the most recent assessments, some trend information, appetite breaches, status, actions, etc. All information we'd be able to see within the specific risks. So we can add to this, or we can go ahead and jump into a specific example like we did today and look at those details. So this is the same scenario we're following, the data breach risk. And then we can go into each of the different areas here. We get to review that information or perform a risk assessment as needed. Another question. So how easy would it be to rework the reporting so that it's possible to see how many outstanding vulnerabilities by process area where these vulnerabilities have not been cleared with a defined SLA? So in that scenario, of course, we would need to have the processes, assets, and vulnerabilities within the platform. From there, we would be able to roll that data up to the process level so we can see since these digital assets are supporting this process, we would know that there's X number of vulnerabilities related to this process. And as far as the SLAs, we are tracking, dates around when they need to be remediated by. So if they're not meeting those SLAs, we'd also be able to go ahead and, flag that as well, and even send out notifications based on that for awareness. We got one more question here. So how about cross-functional processes? How are they visualized in the dashboard? So let's see here. So as far as processes are concerned, we don't have a very well built out process dashboard currently, but as far as cross-functional processes, I would imagine you're probably going to want to go ahead and tag those within your different areas of the organization. And then from there, we do have a very similar report on the CISO dashboard actually, so that might be helpful. We can see exactly what processes are relevant to the different business units as well. So on the right here, we could see the number of different processes within each of those different areas of the organization. Is that sort of what you were asking? I want to make sure I was understanding that question clearly. Great. Right. So yeah, so our licensing is, I'll answer this last question here, then we can go ahead and wrap it up. So the licensing is going to be based on a solution basis. So depending on the different areas you are wanting to look at, we have a few different tiers. So we have our essential and then our business tiers. And then layered on top of that, we also have implementation services. So essentially out of the box, what's provided out of the box versus some additional configuration and consultation with the implementations team. And that's going to be considered product plus. So maybe we're looking at the risk register and we identify that we want to adjust the workflow a little bit or set up some additional fields or attributes. That product plus offering is going to be able to allow you to do that. But yes, it's going to be on a solution basis with those different areas layered on top of it. And we will go ahead and provide you a link over to the SureCloud website with any additional information on that. All right. Well, I appreciate everyone's time today. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate to reach out. You can always email me or anybody else at SureCloud. We're going to go ahead and provide you a link as well. So if you need any other information, you can find that on the website. And yeah, have a great afternoon.